So, one of the hardest, if not the hardest part of preparing a Sunday message is trying to figure out just what God wants me to speak to you about. I mean, this is a big book. It's filled with thousands of lessons, and it's filled with songs and prophecies, and sometime, or most of the time, I don't really know what he wants me to say. And so I usually start by just flipping through each and every book. And I might take my Bible and maybe a commentary over here or something, and I just start flipping through pages until something hits my attention or something interests me, and then I kind of stop and look at it. And then after a while I get the feeling, well, no, that's not right, and I continue on. And so sometimes it can take a few hours just to figure out maybe what I should say up here. I need to find something that catches my eye and piques my attention, so to speak. And this time I was going through my Bible, and I wasn't sure exactly where I was going, and all of a sudden I thought of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was traveling on a train, and the conductor was walking down through the aisles, and he was punching tickets as he came down through the aisle. And so you see Albert reaching in his shirt pockets, in his pants pockets, in his coat pocket, looking at his hat, and he can't find his tickets. And so as the conductor comes forward, he says to him, "I've lost my tickets." And the conductor said, "Well, don't worry about it, Dr. Einstein. I know who you are, and I know that you're an honest man, and I'm sure you purchased the ticket, so it's okay, just relax." And so the conductor took off and continued down the street, or down the aisle. Well, a few people down, he happened to turn back, and guess what? Einstein's on his hands and knees. He's looking under the seats. Where's my tickets? He gets up and he opens up the suitcase luggage rack up here, and he brings it down. He's looking through his suitcase. And so the conductor says, "Dr. Einstein, it's okay. I understand that you purchased a ticket." And he said, "Well, that's fine, sir." He says, I thank you very, very much. He said, "But you know what?" He said, "I still don't know where I'm going." And that's how I felt when I was preparing this message, and how I still feel right now. So sit back, we'll see where this whole thing goes, okay? What piqued my attention was a story about the prophet Micah. Have you ever heard of Micah in the Bible? Yeah, he's one of the minor prophets. They call them minor prophets. And you have two classifications of categories, if you want to, of prophets in the Bible. One is minor and one is major. And it doesn't mean one's better than the other, or one's a bigger prophet than the other, or one has something better to say than the other. It basically is just chosen on the length of their book. You know, so you take someone like Daniel or Isaiah or something, they're major prophets because they go on and on and on and on, 30, 40, 50, 60 chapters in the books. But you come to Micah and he's got 7 little chapters. And that's it. So he's called a minor prophet, but again, that doesn't mean his message isn't important, and it doesn't mean that he wasn't sent to us by God. He is, because every prophet's message, of course, is important to this day. So let me set the stage for you then this morning to what I was thinking when I was preparing all this, and let me ask you a question. What does God want of us? And we know to follow his will, and we know all of that, but really, what does God want of us? If we could really boil it down into something that made more sense than to, well, he wants us to follow his will, what would it be? And I found it in the book of Micah. And thankfully, the people that he was speaking to asked him. They asked Micah, what does God want of us? Pretty much, we'll see that as I get going on here. And he finally got around to asking him, and thankfully they did, because the people were in a terrible, terrible mess. I don't know if you're familiar with your Bible history that much, but the whole nation, well, see, again, it wasn't a whole Jewish nation, because the Jewish nation had split. The Jewish nation had split into a northern kingdom, and it had split into a southern kingdom. Because when King Solomon died, instead of lowering, now Solomon was a great builder. He built a lot of things, and he taxed the people very heavily, kind of like our government does to build things. And when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam was supposed to lower taxes. They thought he would lower taxes, but instead he raised them even more. And so the northern kingdom went their way, and the southern kingdom went their way, just kind of like they did during the Civil War with us. And there was this terrible, terrible fights between them and wars between them. They seemed to always be warring with one another. As a matter of fact, In one battle alone, and it's in the book of Chronicle, it tells us that 120,000 Jews from the southern kingdom were killed in just one battle alone, and it doesn't even mention the northern kingdom. So we can imagine that just as many, or not more, people were killed in just that one battle, and think of 2 or 3 good battles a year going on like that. It was really a terrible time in their history. And then a little while later, to make matters even worse, the Assyrians went to war with the northern tribes and pretty much wiped them off the face of the earth. I mean, we almost lost those 2 tribes completely because of the wars that the northern kingdom itself had with the Syrians. And not only that, but their prophets were false prophets, not Micah, but their so-called prophets were false prophets. They were working with witches and sorcerers and magicians, and they would, these people, these occults would tell them their prophecies, and the prophets would go and sell them to the people. I mean, this place is in terrible shape. And then came along Micah, the prophet. Have you ever noticed how when you're reading through, if you read through the history, if you read through the prophets, of course they're one after another, but if you read through the history of the book, and when the prophets show up, you'll find out that, if you've ever had any Bible studies with me, does anybody remember what I call prophets? Turn or burns. Turn or burns, that's a prophet. Because Israel's going along and everything's smooth, and they turn away from God, and they get like this, they get into the occult, and and all of a sudden, boom, a prophet pops up. Out of nowhere, a prophet shows up. All of a sudden, and he says, turn or burn. Come back to God. Come back to your love of God. Follow God. Come back. And when they come back, and all of a sudden, what? The prophet disappears. And then they go on for a few years, and all of a sudden another prophet comes. And so that's where we are. Every time the people go rogue, if you will, a prophet comes, and every time they get their act together, the prophet goes. And Micah warns the people twice in 7 chapters. The book's not very big, 7 little chapters too. They're not long. They're not like 50 verses in a chapter or something like this, or 50 chapters inside the book. They're very, very small. And guess what? He tells them twice, turn or burn. Turn or burn. You're doing this, turn or burn. You're doing this, turn or burn. And here's what he says. He says, God has had enough. And he says, woe to the oppressors, those who do wrongdoing, who practice evil on their beds, meaning sexual immorality. Woe to those who covet the fields and steal the houses from their neighbors. Woe to them that steal their crops and their inheritance. Woe to those that evict women from their homes, from their pleasant house, he says, from her children, and take away God's splendor forever. So these are some of the things that are happening here during this time and the way the people are acting. Then Micah says, if someone came up to you and he says, I'll prophesy to you today, pay me and I'll prophesy to you today about the wine, you'd pay him, listen to his prophesizing, and then get drunk. I mean, basically that's how bad these people were. So finally, Micah tells the people what God will do, and he tells them in Micah 5, starting in verse 10. It says, and it will be on that day, declares the Lord, that I will eliminate your horses from among you and destroy your chariots. I will also eliminate the cities of your land and tear down your fortifications. This would leave them completely helpless. Now remember, this war is going on, so this would leave them completely helpless. They would not be able to protect themselves in any way. He said, I will eliminate the sorcerers from your hand, and you will have no fortune tellers. So I will get rid of all the witchcraft and all the occult that's going on. I will eliminate your carved images and your memorial stones from among you, so that you will no longer bow down to the work of your hands. People are making graven images. They make these images and they bow down to them and they pray to them. He says, I will root the Ashiam from among you and destroy your cities. The Ashiam was a name of one of the Canaanite gods. And so they were called Ashiams if you followed that god. And so he's saying here, I will uproot your Ashiam, this god, from you. I'll uproot him and get rid of him, and I'll destroy your cities. In verse 15, I will execute vengeance and anger and wrath on the nations you have not obeyed. So that's where we are. That's where our story is right now. And all during this time, Micah is telling the people, turn or burn. Get your act together. He's giving them a warning that God is coming, and the people just refuse to listen. They don't want to hear a thing about it. Then in chapter 6, the people say, okay, all right, we're tired of it. We've had enough. We're tired of listening to you. What does God want? Tell us specifically, what does God want? And here's what they say, the people say, in verses 6 and 7. And listen to you have to understand the way they're saying it. Saying it something like, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down? What shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? What shall I bring? If I'm going to bow down before this God, what shall I bring? Then they go on and say, shall I come with him with burnt offerings and with calves a year old? In other words, should I bring a bunch of one-year-old calves and have a sacrifice, have a burnt offering? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams and 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Kind of sarcastic, isn't it? Will he be pleased with all this stuff? If he's not pleased with burnt offerings, then I'll give him 1,000 rams and the rivers of oil. And it seems to me that they're saying, how do we satisfy him? We just can't, there doesn't seem like there's enough that we can satisfy him with. Do you see what they are? Then they say, shall I offer my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? So should I sacrifice my son or their daughter? How far do I have to go to please you? So the people sound like a bunch of little spoiled brats, don't they? You know what I'm talking about, spoiled brats. Do you guys know any spoiled brats? Do you know any? Put your hand down, Sherry. One for Sherry. And even though the questions are rhetorical, Micah is able to answer that. And he answers it like this. He says this in 6:8. He, God, has shown you, O mortal, what is good. In other words, you already know. He's already shown you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? He says to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, isn't that great? I love that part. Because Micah takes 613 laws that the Old Testament had, that the people were living under, 613 laws that nobody could. How could you save yourself from 613 laws? Nobody could keep them all. I mean, even I've tried it, and I can't do it. I've broken one, you know. But it's an impossible task to do that. But he brings it down to something a lot different, and he gives them just 3 things. Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. So let's look at those 3 this morning, and I think that's what I want to talk to you about. What can we say about doing just or being justly? Well, today, plenty. God is telling us today, and he was telling us then, and he's been telling us forever, that there is right from wrong. That some things are right and some things are wrong. And we call the things that are right absolutes. They're absolutes. You can't change an absolute. There is right and there is wrong. It's not a secret. You and I have been doing it for years. And what's wrong with that today is people are saying there are no absolutes, right? Look at our society. It has to be saying there are no absolutes because they tell us a boy can be a boy and a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy, and there's no absolutes. They can be whatever they want, whatever they feel, whatever they desire, they can be. But we know that that's wrong because God is the one who chooses our sex, not us. And that's an absolute. You were born by God's will as either a male or a female, period, no matter what you do. People today are so messed up with that, they even say that males can get pregnant. No, seriously, you've heard it. You've heard it. And what happens when there are no absolutes in a society? Look what's happening today. It's called confusion. It really is. And who's the author of confusion in the Bible? Satan. Of course he is. He's got the world right where he wants it. This world has quickly become his playground. All of the barriers are gone. The chain link fence that saves the kids inside the playground has been torn down, and he's right in the middle of it. And he's just spreading all of this confusion. Let me give you an example of this. Remember Adam and Eve? God told them specifically in Genesis 2:16, he said this, but you might want to, let's pay attention to this. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, any tree. But you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will what? Surely die. Okay. Look at them closely because they are an absolute, but Satan cunningly and cleverly, devilishly turned God's absolute command into confusion. And here's what he said to the woman. He's so crafty. Here's what he said to the woman. Did God really say you must not eat from what? Any tree. You see how he did that? Did God say you can't eat from any tree? Now we got confusion in here, don't we? She said one thing and he says another thing. So there it is. And God said they could eat from any tree in the garden, but not from this one tree. So the devil asks that. He says, did God say you can't eat from any tree? And to her credit, the woman tries to regain the truth and end the confusion, because in verse 2, she says, 2 and 3, the woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. Now she's right? But God says you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. So you think, okay, the truth has been resolved. It's back. We're back to where we started. But here she's correct, but look where she goes. She says, and you must not what? Touch it or you will die. Where'd that come in? Confusion. That's all it is. It's confusion. You must not touch it or you will die. The devil knows that what he was doing. He was intertwining confusion in with what God said. And when we don't understand his word and when we're confused with his word, what happens? We generally get in trouble and we generally sin. And he found that out way back then, and he's doing the same thing today. He's blinding us with this confusion. So he goes on in verse 4 and 5. He says, you certainly will not die. Well, who are you going to believe? The serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, now he says, you won't die, but let me give you a bonus. What he calls a bonus. See, I want to hit a home run here. I want to bring this. I've got you confused. I've got you sitting on the edge of your seat. You're not sure what's going on. Now let me tell this. There's something good about this. And he says, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good from evil. You see that? Oh, I'd like to know good from evil, wouldn't you? Confusion. It's simple. Let's look at God's absolutes. The first is due justice, which reminds me of what? Another story. Preacher and a bus driver died, standing at the gates of heaven. Preacher walks in. The angel says, welcome, thank you. Hands him a cotton robe and a wooden halo. The bus driver walks in. The angel says, glad to see you, how are you? Hands him a wardrobe, a golden halo, brand new house, car, everything he needs, all of the luxuries there are. Preacher gets upset and he says, why didn't I get those things? And the angel says, well, when you were preaching, people fell asleep. But when he was driving, they prayed. That's justice, you see. That's justice. So let me ask you some questions and see if you agree. Is all life sacred? Yeah. Is all life a blessing from God? Yeah, we can all agree on that. Is God's plan better than man's plan? Sure. There's another story that I want to tell you. A mother had tuberculosis, and the father had syphilis, and there was no penicillin at that time, years ago. There was no antibiotics to take care of any of this. So the couple's first child was born blind. The second child died at birth. The third was born deaf, and the fourth was born with tuberculosis. So we had 4 children from this family. One of them's dead, the other one are born with defects. When she was pregnant for her 5th child, everybody said, no way, No way, abort that baby, get rid of that baby. Don't bring that into this world. But life is an absolute, is it not? It's a gift from God. It's a gift from God. There are many of us today that would just throw that life away like a dirty rag and just get rid of it. But that's not where our story ends here, because the fifth child was born. He was born fine, and he grew up, and you know him. He's extremely famous, and he brought great joy into the world. Any idea who it was? Beethoven. Absolutely right. Beethoven. Who are we to interfere with God's will? Who are we to interfere with his will? Yes, children are born every day with birth defects and with problems, but it's still God's will. It's still God's world. In other words, in our society, people have taken God's justice away from us and from others. Not only from you and I in that sense, but from others as well. And all I can say about that is, dear God, how far have we fallen? How far have we come? Hurry, Jesus, come. And I think one of the biggest problems with society and why people no longer recognize or know what justice is because they don't know what sin is. Right? If you want to know what justice is, you have to know what injustice is. Is that a word? They don't know sin. I'm not sinning. I'm not doing anything wrong. It's my life. If I decide I want to become a girl, I become a girl, and you have to accept me. If I decide I want to do this, you have to accept me. You see, they have no idea of what sin is, and because they don't feel like we do about our sin, and because they don't understand what our sin did to Jesus, and because they don't understand the work that he did on the cross to save us, justice means nothing to them. It was justice and grace that saved us. Christ said it's justice for me to eradicate sin. This sin has to be taken care of. We need to get rid of these lies and rid of these sins. And so it's just for me to go to that cross and die. And he did. Hebrews 6:10 tells us, "For God is not unjust so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name, by having served and by still serving the saints." You know, one day, I can't wait for it, and I hope it's like an arena where we can all watch everybody. I hope it doesn't happen in private, because I want to see each one of us walk up and God says, "I am going to lavishly, extravagantly, generously, exceedingly, abundantly, and wastefully reward everyone in this room." I couldn't think of another word to end it in ly. Lavishly, extravagantly, generously, excessively, abundantly, and wastefully. That's how I'm going to reward you. And what's he going to? So I want to see you all getting your rewards. And what's he going to reward us for? For being there for one another, for giving justice to one another, for giving mercy to one another, for giving grace to one another. That's the day I want to see everybody get their crowns. It'll be a great day. Mercy. It reminds me of what? Another story. Man is driving down the road, sees the yellow light come up before him. So he steps on the gas, which he shouldn't. I know. She'll talk to you about it. Steps on the gas, and just as soon as he steps on the gas, he looks over there and there's a police officer sitting on a motorcycle. Slams on the brakes, comes to a screeching halt, stops that far from the line where he's supposed to stop. Sheepishly, he looks over at the police officer like this. The police officer gets off his motorcycle and goes, "Safe!" Just like an umpire. Throws his arms out. That's mercy. Isn't it? That's mercy. Look at this verse, Luke 6:38. This deals with mercy. Luke 6:38. This verse upsets me. I'll tell you why. "Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return." What does that mean to you? Give. Give, and God will take that and he'll pour it in your lap, and he'll measure it, and he'll press it down, and he'll keep adding it, and what you get in return is 10 times more than what you gave. You get all of that back, right? Now, how many people have seen these so-called pastors, money hawkers on TV? They use that verse all the time. Give me $5, give me $10, give me $100, and God will repay you everything tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold. It will be pressed down, shaken together, and it will be returned to you. They're using it for the wrong thing. He's talking about justice. Give justice, give mercy, give peace, give love. These are the things he's talking about. It has a thing to do with money. But this is what these pastors prey on these poor people with, who believe that, and they give them all their money. And he drives around in a Mercedes or whatever. Which reminds me of what? Story. George Washington Carver. Are you familiar with George Washington Carver? He was a brilliant agricultural scientist back in the 20th century. He was the father of modern agriculture. And some of the practices that he brought forth or he came up with back then to help the soil, regenerate the soil, and to help put nutrients into the soil, it made crops. You'd go from a bushel an acre to 50 bushels of food per acre, just because of the way that he started farming. And so his work increased the yield on many of the different types of crops that we have today. And one day he said, he'd like to tell this story, he said, one day when I was a child, he said, God, tell me the mystery of the universe. I would really like to know the mystery of the universe. And God answered me, he said, and told me, well, that's not for me. He said, only he knows the mystery of the universe. But he said, I'll tell you the mystery of the peanut. And he said, that's about your size. And of course, George Washington Carver said, thank you very much. And he went on to learn the mystery of the peanut and the mystery of wheat and the mystery of corn and the mystery of this, and became this agricultural scientist. Isn't that amazing? In other words, God had mercy on him. That's where that story's going. Tell me the mysteries of the universe. I can't do that, but I'll tell you about peanuts. Cool. That's okay. Whatever God gives us is great. So that's where we are. We've been given laws, rules, absolutes, and it's for our own protection. It really is in the long run. God gave the Jews 613 laws to follow. 613. And Micah boiled it down to 3. Do justly, love mercy, and walk in humility. And even that can be a little bit difficult, so let me boil it down to 2 for you. Anybody remember what they are? I didn't do this, God did this, but let me take those 3 and boil it down to 2. Look at this, Mark 12:30. Give, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your mind, with all your strength. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So we can boil all of those down from 613 to 3 to 2. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Act justly, love mercy, walk in humility with God. Amen.